I am one of the founding directors of the Allies Museum, World War II Liberation of Italy, connecting from Rome. My colleague Rick Cataldo is also here on the line, helping us on the tech, and we're very honored to have Dr. Glyn Harper joining us today from New Zealand for this first webinar of a series that we are going to hold this year. The title of tonight's webinar is The Race for Trieste, How New Zealand Put an Allied Foot in the Door. And we're going to explore with Dr. Harper the participation of New Zealand to the Italian campaign during World War II. Before doing that, though, I would like to talk a little bit about our mission as a museum. We are working on launching a new museum in Rome, the Allies Museum. This is dedicated to the 1.2 million men and women from 25 countries all over the world that came together to liberate Italy from Nazi fascism, starting in July 1943 with the Operation Aschia landing in Sicily, all the way to May 1945, with obviously the liberation of Trieste and the end of the campaign. These were really the first defender of freedom and democracy to set foot in Europe and open up the new front that was later followed by, obviously, Normandy and D-Day in June 1944. As a mission for the museum, it is to bring these stories from all over the world. Today, obviously, we're talking about New Zealand, but in future months, we're going to be talking about other countries. We dedicated January to India. The month of March will be dedicated to Greece, and then April will be Australia, and one country every month after that. And if you're not already following our newsletter, we strongly recommend to join that. We're going to again have other webinars about most of these countries and discover how young people from all over the world came to Italy and fought during World War II to make the country what it is today. As a mission for the museum, we have to commemorate, obviously, people who served. Unfortunately, today, less than 1% of service members that fought in the Italian campaign are still with us due to the passing of time, as we're approaching the 80th anniversary of the end of the campaign. We have also the mission to educate those who are serving. That's why we work closely with the armed forces of various countries, and obviously inspires those who will serve. So inspire the future generation, young people that might not firsthand have an opportunity to know somebody who was in the campaign, and we hope through the work of our museum to be able to inspire them, telling them about what young people like them did 80 years ago and the sacrifices they had to endure. And the spirit of the museum, as you will see in our last slide, is united in history, united in victory, united in history. Our goal is to bring together the history of each country and tell this amazing international tale as a unified story for today's world's youth. There are many ways to get involved in the museum. Obviously, you can visit us on our website and discover yourself, but we are looking for help in ways like, for example, spreading the word about the work that we're doing here in Rome, in your own local area, wherever you are in the world. We operate in 14 countries. These are many of the ones I cited. All are, the full list is obviously available on our website. We are already started to collect artifacts donations, and we're going to make some major announcement in that regard soon. We're also about to become operative in Rome in terms of being able to welcome visitors, to show them some of the sites that we're going to talk about in our museum, and there's going to be some upcoming announcement in relation to that. And obviously, we have many volunteers that help us in the operations, fundraising, and other activities. So if you are interested, please contact us, as obviously we need your help. Without further ado, though, I would like to go into tonight's topic and introduce you to Dr. Glyn Harper. Glyn was a professor of war studies at Massey University. He retired in 2021. He completed a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts with honors and a teaching degree at Canterbury University before moving to Australia in 1988 to teach. As a student at Christchurch, Glyn joined the Territorials as a holiday job, which piqued his interest in military life. He joined the Australian Army in 1988, where he completed his Doctor of Philosophy degree with a thesis on the New Zealand commander Sir Howard Kippenberger at the University of New England. In 1996, Glyn transferred to the New Zealand Army, where he rose to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel as an head of Military Study Institute. While serving in the New Zealand Army, Glyn was the Army's official historian for the deployment to East Timor and co-wrote the official history and a children's book about the deployment. Glyn left the New Zealand Army in 2001 and taught military history at Massey University for more than 20 years. In 2011, Glyn was appointed by Massey University as the project manager for the Centenary History of New Zealand and the First World War program, and he wrote 2 of the 14 volumes of the Centenary History. He's the award-winning author of more than 20 books for adults and 13 books for children, many of which have achieved best-selling status. In 2012, Glyn was awarded a QSM for services to historical research. And Glyn is currently the academic advisor of Project Army 200, the 200-year history of the New Zealand Army, and is working on several new books. Please welcome Dr. Harper with us. Well, Glyn, thank you for being with us this morning there in New Zealand. We would like to start this fireside chat showing this image, which is the very beginning of the New Zealand's participation in the Italian campaign with the arrival in Taranto in October 1943. Obviously, New Zealand forces, Air Force and Navy had already been involved in the campaigns in Sicily, but in terms of land forces, this is where and when they arrived. And I would like to start this talk this evening really thinking about the involvement of New Zealand, right? Like the moment of the war, right? The North African campaign had been successfully ended for the Allies, right? And now there was this push into Europe for Sicily first and then southern Italy. New Zealand, which obviously is a country, on the other side of the world that had a front much closer to home in the Pacific, was asked by Britain to join the Italian campaign. And despite, again, war raging in the Pacific, decided to join the Allies in Italy and send significant troops to the campaign. Could you tell us, who was sent and how was this decision received by New Zealanders? Were people sort of overall in favor? What was the sentiment at that point in New Zealand? Obviously, considering that they had been fighting already for over 4 years in World War II.
Yeah. Well, it is an important question, and thank you for having me here this morning and hosting this session. The New Zealand Second New Zealand Expeditionary Force back to fight in the Pacific, and they did that 3 times during the war. They considered it in Parliament 3 separate times and had a large debate about it. And this is one of the reasons why New Zealand was not involved in Operation Husky, the amphibious landing in Sicily, as you to be involved in the campaign in Sicily. And Churchill, Alexander and Montgomery had requested the New Zealand government to make the division available, but they said no because they were considering the question in Parliament as to whether they should bring the land forces of New Zealand back to fight in the Pacific War, as Australia had done, and Australia was asking them to do that. But each time they considered it, and they made the decision after considerable soul searching to keep the New Zealand Division and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force in the Mediterranean and fight in the Italian campaign through to its end. There were several reasons why they made that decision. First off, Churchill was very eloquent in persuading them to stay there. And his language was, extremely persuasive. He said something like, "We're very reluctant to see the New Zealand Division leave the scene of all its glories, and there's still work to be done." So that was one reason. There was Churchill's eloquence, but there was also the request of the American president, Roosevelt, for the New Zealand Division to remain where it was. And that was what really persuaded the New Zealanders to do that, particularly as Roosevelt said, that if you keep your division and your expeditionary force fighting in the Mediterranean campaign, we will send Marines and soldiers to New Zealand and if anything happens, they will be there to protect the nation. So it was kind of like a quid pro quo. And New Zealand also accepted that there would be tremendous difficulties bringing this really, really tight. And the other thing that the New Zealanders did, unlike the Australians, was they viewed the Second World War as one war, not two separate wars, but one war. Whereas the Australian Prime Minister, John Curtin, had said the Pacific War was a new war, and that's where Australia should make its main effort. The New Zealand government always viewed it as one big campaign, and they wanted to make their efforts count where it would be most effective. And they came to the conclusion that that would be in the Mediterranean fighting the Italian campaign. And they actually persuaded the New Zealand public and soldiers that that was the case. It was accepted by them, and the Prime Minister, Peter Fraser, made a very good argument that we are fighting one war and we will make our main effort where it's going to count most. Got to say, it did affect the morale of New Zealand soldiers fighting in Italy, so far away from home when New Zealand was at threat. There was a cost to that. In fact, in June 1944, Freiburg advised the New Zealand government that the New Zealand division was absolutely war weary, had lost its fighting edge, and should be withdrawn from Italy. That was the third time that the New Zealand government considered it. And in September, they made the decision that rather than bring the division back home, they would replace the men in the division. The division would stay there until the end of the Italian campaign, but they would replace all men in the division who had 3 years or more service, and they would also restructure the division to give it more infantry, because at the time it only had 2 infantry brigades and 1 armour brigade, and the terrain wasn't really suitable for the use of armour. Now that decision meant that the New Zealand division was in a unique position. It was the only division that remained with the 8th Army. It was there at the beginning when the 8th Army was formed in North Africa, and it was fighting with the 8th Army at the end of the war in Italy at Trieste, which is unique. There was no other division that had been there at the beginning that remained with the 8th Army until the end of the war. So that is why the New Zealanders were kept and why they fought up the Italian peninsula to the end of the war.
Thank you, Glenn. And in terms of who was sent, were they volunteer? Was there a draft going on in New Zealand? You said they were replaced at some point, the men in the division. How was that process?
No, they were drafted. They were conscripts. New Zealand introduced conscription relatively early in the war, but they only conscripted for the army. Everybody that served in the Navy and the Royal New Zealand Air Force were volunteers, but they conscripted for the army, and the men sent there were conscripts, and they were also men from the 3rd New Zealand Division. New Zealand did have a division fighting in the Pacific War for just over 2 years, the 3rd New Zealand Division. It only had 2 brigades of infantry, but when they made that decision in December, they decided to actually disband the 3rd New Zealand Division and send its soldiers to fight in Italy. So they were conscripts, men who'd been newly conscripted, or they were men who'd fought in the Pacific campaign but were now being sent to Italy to finish the war in Italy.
Thank you. And, talking about the end part, right? So you said, obviously, they were with the 8th Army all the way to Trieste. Here in this picture, we see New Zealand soldier meeting Yugoslavian partisans in Trieste in May 1945, just after the end of the campaign. On the 2nd of May 1945, we are 2 days after Hitler committed suicide in his bunker at the very, very end of the war, and the 2nd New Zealand Division arrives in Trieste in what we now remember as the race for Trieste. What was this operation, and did New Zealand arrive in time to, as Churchill said it, put a foot in the door? And what was at stake if they had not? Could Trieste have ended up on the other side of the Iron Curtain, given that the Yugoslavian partisans were also there?
Yeah. Yeah, the New Zealand division was ordered to reach Trieste as soon as possible on the 30th of April, and to actually take Route 14, the coast road. And there was a rush to get to Trieste because there was the worry that this area was going to be claimed by Yugoslavia, and with the backing of the Soviet Union. And the New Zealand division was sent primarily because it was a mobile division and a very powerful division. At this time, it had the ability to move 3 infantry brigades and 1 armored brigade, mobile. And so that's an incredibly powerful infantry force, as well as 150 Sherman tanks, which you have in your arsenal, which means that they could outgun the local Yugoslav partisans if needed. They reached Trieste at the same time as the Yugoslavs, and there was some fighting to liberate the city. There was a stalemate for quite some time until the Yugoslavs decided that they weren't going to win this, and that they needed to withdraw, and that let the governments decide where the boundaries would be drawn. I've no doubt that they did save Trieste from becoming part of the Iron Curtain. It's regarded by many historians as the first battle of the Cold War. And as you alluded to Churchill's quote to Alexander, I'm very glad that you got to Trieste and this region in time to put your foot in the door before it was closed shut. So I think you're getting to Trieste as quickly as they did with that much force really did save that region and the city, and so that it remained part of Italy.
Thank you. And where, to your knowledge, New Zealanders are aware of this upcoming Cold War, of this, up until then, technically Yugoslavia had been an ally, right? We know in other contexts that there was a perception of the shifting of the tide, right? This war was coming to an end, and a new Cold War was beginning. But among the New Zealand troops, was it understood that there was this risk, and was there any understanding of what would have happened if there'd been, I mean, there were, but if there'd been fights with the Yugoslavian?
I think it caught the soldiers by surprise, particularly the hostility of the Yugoslav partisans, who didn't make them at all welcome. They were armed to misleading information. I think General Freiberg, the commander of the New Zealand division, was well aware of the stakes involved, but I don't think the general soldiers were, and they were quite surprised at what they found there, particularly, and they didn't quite understand the politics of the region either. So they were actually quite surprised to find themselves among people who they thought were their allies, but who treated them with a lot of hostility and suspicion.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and again, we are going to talk again about this region that, for anyone who's not familiar, we're going to show a map, but it's the northeast side of Italy. Other Allied troops were stationed there. Some were actually attacked and killed by Yugoslavian partisans. So this was, definitely the first, as Glyn put, the beginning of the Cold War, and first sort of the first hostilities as the two fronts collided right there. And Glyn, looking now at the overall map, right, showing the path that the New Zealand division took, right? We showed Taranto, which, for anyone who's not familiar, is a big harbor city at the very bottom here of the map. You see it under Bari, in the Puglia region. That's where they arrived in 1943, and close to 2 years later, right, having crossed all of Italy, having gone through the Gustav Line with the Battle of Cassino, the liberation of Florence, and the fall of the Gothic Line into the Po Valley, and then, as we see it here, all the way to Trieste. They contributed to some of the main battles across the entire campaign. If you were to pick a soldier from the New Zealand division that participated in the campaign to put a statue to or a plaque, who would you pick? Who would be a representative soldier for the New Zealand division?
Yeah, it's a really hard question, and I'm not sure you could do it for just one soldier, because there are so many contenders. I mean, would you put up a statue of Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, the commander, Victoria Cross, a recipient from the First World War who spent 5 years in command and is there at the end. The amazing that he remains in command throughout the war. Could it be my hero, Howard Kippenberger, who you mentioned before, who's the Major General fighting at Casino, but treads on an anti-personnel mine and is seriously wounded soldiers who are at Casino and left stranded at the railway station for virtually a whole day. Then there are the tank crews, who are fighting in Sherman tanks and coming up against Tiger tanks, which are three times their size. Then there's also the hospitals and the medics and the doctors. Although, really I couldn't go past the average infantry soldier who's slugging it out in the mud, the rain, the heat of the summer, with so many rivers to cross and with another one in front of it. There are just so many contenders, and I don't think one would do it. But if I had to pick, I would pick an average infantry soldier who's slugging it out up through this really hostile terrain from Taranto to Trieste. I think that's who I'd do it to, the average infantry soldier.
Thank you, Glyn. And, it's not shown in the map, but beyond all the rivers that you can see, there's mountains and mountains that they have to cross. At to Glyn's earlier point, for anyone not familiar with the geography of Italy, tanks weren't, the easy way to go through the country. Often mules work better. And obviously the German defensive position were very hard to overcome. So it is incredibly impressive how New Zealand fought with this division throughout the entire campaign. And Glyn, one thing that maybe some people might not be familiar, and we dedicated a number of things in our newsletter about, was the Maori participation within the New Zealand division. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
In the First World War, Maori had wanted to fight, but they were not permitted to form their own battalion, and they were not permitted to fight as frontline soldiers. They were pioneers, although they did fight as infantry at Gallipoli because they were so short as soldiers. In the Second World War, they requested and were granted the ability to maintain a infantry battalion, the 28th Maori Battalion. And it is a battalion with a formidable reputation, and one that fights in nearly all the main battles, from Operation Crusade in North Africa to Alamein, and of course at Casino, where they do the bulk of the fighting in the February battle. And they are there right at the end too in Trieste, and they prove themselves to be a formidable infantry battalion, and with a thoroughly deserved reputation for being fearsome warriors.
Thank you. And for anyone interested, we have some incredible imagery of Maori soldiers performing aka during the campaign. Some of the images that one might associate with, the rugby matches today during the campaign is quite an incredible sight. So now we can, open up for question. If anyone has a question, we'll take it in the chat, which I'm gonna open now. 1 second. I'll stop the share so I can see the chat. And you can find the chat on your right. Okay, I see there's already a couple of questions here from the audience. So the first one is, so Glyn, you mentioned that the New Zealand Parliament voted 3 times in favor of supporting the war in Europe. How did the New Zealand public feel about this involvement? In the sense of what were the main ways they received war news, and did the public support fluctuate during the campaign, given how long it was? And were there any notable peaks or declines in public sentiment in terms of being in favor or against? And I mean, we also have to remember that there were considerable losses of the New Zealand forces. I mean, there are New Zealand soldiers buried in many of the dozens of war cemeteries that the Commonwealth Great Commission takes care across Italy. So this was a very significant loss of life by the division.
Yeah, it's a good question, and you're right. There are over 2,000 New Zealanders buried on the Italian mainland through the fighting in the peninsula. There was some opposition to keeping the division in uh, Italy and in the Mediterranean campaign, and the New Zealand opposition did make some protest about it. But in general, the New Zealand Prime Minister made a very thorough job of explaining why the division was kept there, and he also pointed out that it had been requested by both our main allies, the United Kingdom and the United States, and there were ways that they were making. I mean, the whole working population of New Zealand was mobilised to support the Second World War and the home front. Also, the New Zealand war effort in the Pacific, once the division is withdrawn, is done through a significant Air Force contribution. At the end of the war, New Zealand has something like 20 squadrons fighting in the Pacific region, and over 1,000 aircraft. We've never had that number before. So the New Zealanders accepted it, and they accepted Peter Fraser's view that this was one war rather.
Glyn, we can't hear you. Hopefully, we momentarily lost Dr. Harper. Glyn, we lost you for a second there at the end of the answer.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, I'm gonna proceed to the next question.
And there was a okay.
Okay, thank you. Can you map the progress of the New Zealand division north of Rome? So once obviously Cassino falls and Rome is liberated, what were the main battles between, let's say, Rome and the Gothic line?
They well, it's a very slow progress of both armies advancing north of Rome, and really the around Florence, on the Gothic line, and also the town of Faenza. The last big set piece battle that the New Zealanders fight is at the Guyana River, and that really is the time that they deal to the paratroopers who have caused them so much trouble before at Cassino and in Crete. But after the Battle of the Guyana River, they really just follow up a retreating and withdrawing German army that has been defeated. Of course, they are involved in not just one battle at Cassino, but two. There's a battle in February and another battle in March. But at the end of the March battle, they are withdrawn and given a subsidiary role in the fourth battle of Cassino after that.
Thank you, Glyn. And I want to add that, because I know through family that the city of Arezzo was liberated by the New Zealand division. I have relatives there, and I still remember. Thank you for that. We have Professor Sika would like to ask a question. Emmanuel, if you can hear us, you're free to ask.
Yes. Professor Harper, first of all, thank you very much. I mean, for the lightning talk. I have a question for you, actually, because I did visit in many battlefield tour, touring Italy, the Commonwealth, cemeteries, and of course, I noticed also the New Zealand soldiers, actually the graves, of the New Zealand buried with their comrade in arms, actually from the Commonwealth. One question I asked myself was, and that goes back to one of the research I did for the First World War, is to whom the body belonged, in the sense that did the family ask for the repatriation actually of the bodies, or were there actually decision made by New Zealand government an army and forces to keep the bodies basically, you know, in military cemeteries in Italy. Considering the distance, of course, between New Zealand and Italy, and of course, you know, these have been one way or the other controversial, right? I mean, one thing is having, I don't know, even the English. I mean, you know, at that time was quite a trip. I mean, to go to from England to Italy, but from New Zealand, I mean, especially in the 1940s, it was quite a substantial trip that I think most of the family could not afford, you know, in many ways. So, what was the decision actually? Were all the bodies kept in Italy, or were there some repatriated? I mean, what was there a choice, you know, given to the families?
Yeah, good question. No, there was no choice. And all of the bodies, all the soldiers killed in Italy are buried in Italy. Goes back to a policy of the New Zealand government in the First World War that they would not repatriate bodies of their soldiers, but they would bury them in battlefields near where they fell, and if possible, build a memorial nearby as well. So no New Zealand soldiers who were killed have ever come back to New Zealand apart from the Unknown Warrior, the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior, who was brought back to New Zealand in 2004, and he is from a battlefield on the Somme. But the decision was made that soldiers would be buried near where they fell. And so no New Zealand soldiers' bodies have ever come home.
But was this controversial in New Zealand, or there were any opposition
No,
now to
no, it was not controversial because it was accepted that they would all be equal in death. And no matter if you were a general killed overseas or a private, you would remain where you fell. And for that reason, too, the New Zealanders did not permit inscriptions to be written on their tombstones by
That's right.
family members because there was a charge for that, and not everybody could afford it. So their feeling was they needed to be equal in death. No, it was accepted. Very painful for the families, and often they would request a soldier, a friend, to go along and photograph the grave and send a photograph back of it. But because very few families could actually visit those graves. But no, it was not a controversial policy. It was accepted because it was equally applied to everybody who went overseas.
Thank you, Glyn, and thank you, Manuel, for the question. We have another question from the audience, which is related to what do New Zealanders today study in school about World War II. You mentioned, Glyn, obviously that New Zealand fought more in Europe by the end than in the Pacific, but the Pacific was obviously closer to home. So do young, I think about high school, like do New Zealander in high school when they study World War II, if they study World War II, maybe that's the first question. Do they study World War II? And then if they do they feel, oh, we were in Italy, liberating Italy, or was it all one war and there's not specific attention to the Italian Empire versus the Pacific?
Yeah, unfortunately, the Second World War is not widely covered in New Zealand schools. It really depends on whether the teacher has an interest. It's available in the curriculum, but the teachers can choose from it. The conflicts that they tend to choose are the New Zealand wars. So it tends to overshadow what happened in the Second World War. And I have to say, in the Second World War, the Italian campaign remains largely forgotten. In fact, I'm giving a talk at the end of the year about the Italian campaign, and that's the title of it, The Forgotten Campaign. Very few people know how long, hard, and arduous and where New Zealand's efforts were made in the Italian campaign. So I have to say, regrettably, that the Second World War does not get much coverage, and the Italian campaign gets scarcely any coverage at all.
Thank you, Glenn. And one more question from the audience. Can you tell us more about General Freiberg, the general, to your point, that was head of the division up to the liberation of Trieste?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Freiberg was actually born in the United Kingdom, but he came to New Zealand when he was 2 years old. So he was educated in New Zealand. And when the First World War broke out, he made his own way to the United Kingdom, approached Winston Churchill on the street for a commission in the Royal Naval Division and was granted one, and had a distinguished military career in the First World War. He was the youngest ever brigadier. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for fighting on the Somme. And when the Second World War broke out, the New Zealanders didn't feel, this is quite surprising, didn't feel they had a general who they could trust with their New Zealand division. So they approached Freyberg, who had been invalided out of the British Army with a heart murmur, to take on the command of the New Zealand division. So he was appointed at the end of 1939, and he remained in command throughout the war from 1939 until the end of the war in 1945. He did give up the division a couple of times when he had a corps command, and that was in Crete and at the end of the North African campaign, and also at Casino, where he was commanding the New Zealand Corps. But a remarkable soldier, a very effective soldier. But he also said that was the limits of his ability, because he didn't think he could command a corps. So very distinguished soldier. He was actually Governor General of New Zealand for 2 terms after the war as well, and has a formidable reputation.
Thank you, Glyn. So I think we are close to the end. I'm just gonna check. Oh, there's one more question. Yes. So you mentioned obviously the New Zealand Second Division fought within the 8th Army throughout the entire campaign. Who did they fight alongside with? Which other countries were they?
Oh, yeah. Well, certainly in North Africa, the 8th Army was very much a Commonwealth army, so they fought alongside Australians, they fought alongside South Africans and the 51st Highland Division. In Italy, they fight very much alongside the Indians and the Canadians. But for Casino, they're actually moved out of the 8th Army and seconded to the American 5th Army for some time. So they fight alongside American soldiers as well. But after Casino, they walk back to the 8th Army and they remain with it for the rest of the war. So when they're advancing north of Rome, they always have an Indian division on the left.
Glyn, we lost you there for a second. Glyn, can you hear us? I think we lost you.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I lost the
Yes.
connection. The joys of living in a little country town in New Zealand. But Guido, are you there?
Yes, we can hear you.
Where did you lose me?
Sort of.
Okay. Yeah.
You were mentioning they got to Italy and they fought alongside the Indians and the Canadians in Casino, and then they got with the U.S. Army. That.
Yeah. Well, and after Casino, when they're moving north of Rome, they seem to have an Indian division on their left flank and the Canadians on their right flank. Although they also fought alongside the 6th South African Armoured Division for a while as well. So it was very, very much fighting alongside allies from the Commonwealth.
Yeah. And one question for us, which actually it's a good question. You mentioned that it is unfortunately a forgotten campaign. Is there a good account that you can point out to of the New Zealand-Italian campaign? Was there ever a book written by any New Zealand historian that sort of is a good overall account of the participation of New Zealand to Italy?
There has not been a single account since the official histories, and to prepare myself for this talk, I actually reread the official history written by Robin Kay of the New Zealanders in Italy after Monte Cassino. There are 2 official histories of New Zealand in the Italian campaign. One by a guy called Neville Phillips, who does the the battles up to Casino and all the Casino battles, and then the second volume of Italy looks at everything after Casino, and they are really good.
I think we lost you again, Glenn, but we'll add links for anyone interested. We'll add links to both books in together with the recording. So we'll be able to do that afterwards. And then we have one remaining question. If Glyn, can you hear us? Hoping we can get him back. Glyn, can you hear us? Glyn, can you hear us? Okay, that's the copy. Yeah, we'll add a link to the books afterwards. So I think we have one last question, and it relates back to the comment on the different fighting conditions in Italy. Then, if we think about North Africa, right, the campaign that they just fought and won, and very different terrain. How did the New Zealanders feel about fighting in Italy? Which obviously is a very different landscape, beautiful landscape, but maybe not the one that they might have expected, having fought in North Africa up until that point.
Well, they actually struggled with it. They were not well structured to be fighting in a terrain like Italy with the mountains and rivers. In North Africa, the New Zealanders had become sick of being overrun by German panzers without their own armour protection. So they had made the decision that they would convert the division into an armoured division. So they'd have 2 infantry brigades and 1 armoured brigade. And of course, when they get to Italy, they find that it's limited how you could use armor, and what you need really in Italy are many infantry soldiers who are skilled in mountain fighting and particularly skilled in river crossings. And New Zealanders were not skilled at that. They were actually more used to fighting in the North African campaign with armor, and they struggled for quite some time. And the solution was in the middle of 1944 to recommend that had been they have 3 infantry while they're fighting in North Africa past the Gothic line. So they were really not well structured to fight in Italy. And it took them some time to adjust to the terrain and having them in mountain warfare crossings.
Thank you, Glenn. And then
I hope you got that.
Yes, most of that. We have temporarily turned off everybody's video to hope that maybe makes the connection a bit smoother. One more question from the audience. You mentioned that after 3 year plus of service, troops were able to be sent home, right? After 3 years of service, you got sent home. Did they then, was anybody then sent back to Europe, or was this sort of a one-way street in a sense? Because obviously I imagine that the trip was quite long. So was anybody sent back to fighting? And if not, or if yes, how did the other troops feel about people no longer, being sort of gone for good?
2 parts to that question. The decision in September to send the long-term men back was a one-way trip. They were going back to New Zealand and being discharged, and that was the end of the war. Prior to that, at the end of North Africa, the New Zealand government had implemented a furlough scheme, furlough being a long leave scheme where they were given 3 months leave. So long-term soldiers were sent back to New Zealand on long-term leave. The problem was that not many of them wanted to come back again. So they actually, it was a mini mutiny. And few of the furlough men came back, only a few hundred from several thousand. But the one I mentioned in September 1944, the long-term men going back to New Zealand were not coming back to serve again. They were being discharged and becoming civilians.
Okay, thank you. Well, want to thank Dr. Harper again for joining us this morning in New Zealand, evening here in Rome. Thank you everybody for joining and asking really very insightful questions. I think I can say on behalf of everybody, thank you, Glyn. This was really a treat. And again, as mentioned, we'll link with the recording some of the books that were mentioned by Glyn. And obviously, if anybody wants to learn more about New Zealand and hasn't had a chance to read our latest newsletter, we add also there a number of documents, videos, and links that discuss the participation of New Zealand in the Italian campaign. So again, thank you all, and hope to see you in a future webinar about the Italian campaign and other countries